Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I will start with the moment that burned a line straight through the afternoon and made everyone stare at their plates like the food suddenly got complicated, because my mother lifted her glass, smiled that smile she uses when she wants to make sure everyone hears her, and announced that my sister had just opened her own business, and then, without even a pause to let the congratulations land, she turned to me with the kind of cheerfulness that feels like a slap and said, "And when will you do something impressive?" And I looked at her for as long as it took to decide I was done explaining myself and said, "I did, you just were not on the guest list," and it slid out of me so quietly that it took a breath for the table to catch up. And by the time it did, there was that hush that tells you the point isn't only what you said, it is what you meant. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant right away, that I lifted my own glass and enjoyed the silence like a victory lap, but the truth is I felt my chest tighten the way it does when someone pretends they are curious, but is really keeping score. And even though I knew exactly what I was doing, I could still hear the little voice that always jumps up and says, "Just let it go, do not ruin the day, it is not worth it." And yet I also knew that I had spent too many years letting it go, letting the comments pass, letting the spotlight swing right over me as if I were the wall, and that after a while you start to think maybe you're the wall, and you start arranging yourself around other people's applause like your job is to hold the room together while they celebrate. My sister, Hannah, blinked and did that fast little laugh she does when she wants to look above the drama, and my father stared at the grill like the meat needed moral support. And a couple of cousins shifted in their chairs because they know our family rhythms and could feel that familiar undertow where the conversation looks normal from the shore but pulls you out the moment you step into it. And my mother, who is very good at keeping things moving in the direction she planned, lifted her eyebrows and said, "Well, that was dramatic," and then tried to push the focus back to Hannah, and I let her try because I already knew I had planted the seed and that it would sit there in the center of the table no matter how many bowls got passed over it. If you want to understand why that sentence came out of me, you need to know that this isn't about one barbecue or one comment. It is about years of being introduced as the sensible one while my sister got the more exciting words. Years of hearing that I was dependable and practical, which are compliments until the day they become code for not worth noticing. Years of family calls where my updates got folded into the last 2 minutes before goodbye while my sister's plans took up the main program, and yes, I learned to shrug it off and get on with my life, but that does not mean it didn't shape the way I walked into rooms where my own family decided ahead of time who would be interesting and who would be background. It is funny how people claim to value humility until they meet a version of it that does not benefit them, because what my mother liked most was not that I was humble, it was that I was quiet. That I did not correct her when she narrated my life in the dullest possible terms, that I did not contradict the story where I was always almost doing something while my sister was always almost famous. And it took me a long time to realize those stories are not harmless, that they sit in your mouth like a metal taste and make you swallow your own excitement before you have even said it out loud, and that after a while you stop telling your news because you do not want to stand there and watch it be minimized like a receipt for something small. So when I said you were not on the guest list, what I meant was that I had learned to stop offering my joy to people who treated it like a footnote, and that I had built something I cared about with people who actually showed up. And that I had made a choice to protect it from the kind of attention that turns everything into a comparison game. My sister always wins by default, because my mother set the rules years ago, and once you say that out loud, even in a sentence as simple as "you are not on the guest list," the room changes shape, and you can feel the old script start to slip. Hannah tried to fill the space with chatter about leases and logos and the thrill of being your own boss, and I nodded because I know exactly how much work goes into building anything from zero, and I am not the villain who wants to steal her moment. But I could also feel my mother's attention flicking back at me like a light she could not leave off, and there was a part of me that felt almost sorry for her because it unsettled her to realize there was a part of my life she did not control or even know about, and she does not handle not knowing very well, which is why the next thing she said came out in that sweet tone that is basically a dare. "What guest list, dear? What are you talking about, since apparently you are very important these days?" I could have laughed it off and told a harmless joke and let everyone breathe, but I did not, because that would have put everything back in its place, which is exactly what she wanted. So instead I said that sometimes you figure out who supports you by watching who claps without being asked, and that lately I have been very careful to invite only those people, and yes, that was cryptic and maybe a little cruel, but it was also honest. And I made sure to keep my voice even and my face calm. Because displays of emotion get used against you in families like mine, and I have learned to hold my ground with a steady tone and a clear boundary. Before anyone could jump in, my phone buzzed with a message that made me smile in spite of myself, not because it was dramatic, but because it was exactly the kind of quiet confirmation that tells you your choice to keep certain things private was right. And my mother saw the smile, of course she did, and she said, "Do you want to share with the group?" And I put my phone face down and said, "Not with this group." And there it was again, that little shock at the center of the table, the one that told them I had lines they could not cross anymore, and if you were sitting with me now I would tell you this was not a tantrum or a power play. It was the first time I refused to let the people who always minimize me write the caption under my life. If you are wondering what the guest list was for and why I drew that line so firmly, hold that thought, because the answer is coming, and it is bigger than a party and sharper than a brag. And it started the day I realized that keeping certain victories out of my family's spotlight was not petty, it was survival, and once I figured that out, everything else I did next made perfect sense, even if they did not see it coming. If I told you that the line at the barbecue came from nowhere, I would be lying, because what stood behind it was not one awkward afternoon, but a long stretch of small scenes that looked harmless on their own and turned corrosive in a row. Like the time my mother bragged to a neighbor that Hannah was already thinking like a leader while I was described as steady and sensible, which is a nice way to say boring when you are deciding who gets the loud applause at the table, and like the birthdays, where my sister's gifts were framed as investments in her future, while mine were useful things wrapped in comments about practicality. And like school events where my mother's face lit up for Hannah's parts while my moments earned careful nods that felt more like signatures than celebration, and you would think you stop caring once you grow up. But what actually happens is that you learn to manage the instinct to explain yourself to people who built a scoreboard with your name in small print. There was this pattern that kept repeating in a way that became almost funny if I took 3 steps back and swallowed the sting, because every time I tried something new my mother would ask careful questions that sounded supportive and landed like tests, as if the purpose of my choices was to prove I was not making a mistake rather than to live a life that felt like mine. And even when she was trying, even when she was speaking softly and picking her words with care, I could hear the sentence behind the sentences, the one that said, "Stay in the lane we drew for you. Do not make a mess. Do not take up the kind of space that requires applause. Save that for the child I already chose as the main event." And once you hear that enough times, you either break apart trying to get promoted in your own family, or you stop auditioning for a role that was never open. I did try, and I will own that, because I remember a dinner where I mentioned a project I was excited about and the way my mother blinked and said it sounded nice, maybe a hobby, while pivoting to ask Hannah about her next big step. And the way my father cleared his throat and asked me about practical details like stability and safety and whether I had considered the timing, and even though none of this was cruel, not exactly, the combined effect felt like someone patting me on the head and telling me to keep my voice down while the real program continued. And when I got home, I scrolled back through our group chat and realized the transcript of our family life read like a newsletter with one featured subject every week. And it never seemed to be me unless I was babysitting someone else's crisis. What made it worse, if I am being honest, was that Hannah learned to shape herself to the attention in a way that kept me locked in the supporting role, because her updates were always announcements and mine were always status checks. Her stories were framed as leaps and mine as maintenance, and I do not blame her for playing the part she was handed, but I am also not going to pretend it did not wear grooves into how we all moved around each other, and that by the time we were grown women the choreography was so practiced that it took a deliberate act to break it, and deliberate acts do not happen unless you have finally run out of patience with polite endurance. The moment I reached that point was not loud, and it did not involve a fight. It was a morning when I stared at a blank message box trying to type a simple update about my week, and I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. because I could already hear the lukewarm replies and the pivot to whatever Hannah's new plan was, and I closed the app and stood in my kitchen and decided that if I did not want to be the afterthought, I had to stop volunteering for the role, which meant changing not only what I said but where I said it, and to whom, and with what expectation. And yes, that sounds like a long way around to a small decision, but when a pattern is years deep, a small decision can feel like an explosion. So I changed the way I talked to them, starting with that chat none of us could seem to leave alone, because it had turned into a stage for one person and a polite bench for the rest of us, and I was done sitting on that bench while pretending the show was balanced. So I did something I had never done before, and it was petty in the clean way that tells you it is less about revenge and more about balance, but it still tasted like relief, and yes, I smiled while I did it, because sometimes the smallest lever moves more than you think, and because I knew exactly how it would land. I opened the group chat and read through a week of messages that might as well have been a press kit, and I edited the group name to read Hannah Updates, because accuracy is a kindness even when it stings. And then I wrote one single sentence that said, since this has clearly become a broadcast channel, I am opting out, and I backed it up by leaving the chat and creating a new one called People Who Actually Ask Back, and I added my cousins who always check on me, my aunt who listens without turning my stories into warnings, and my dad on the private thread where he is looser and kinder without my mother directing the music. And when the notifications started lighting up on my screen with the old chat's reactions, I let them stack without answering. Because victory is not only a shout, sometimes it is a decisive quiet. You might say that was childish, and I get that, but it was also the first time I put a label on our dynamic that they could not pretend not to see. And even though my mother called me immediately and left a message about family unity and hurt feelings and how public gestures make private rifts worse, I did not call back right away, because for once the discomfort was not only mine to carry. And because it was not a rupture I wanted to heal with quick apologies and a return to the old program. It was a reset I needed them to sit with, and to be honest, it worked, because the cousins texted to tell me they were relieved someone said it out loud, and my aunt sent a heart that felt like a real vote of confidence rather than a seasonal greeting. And my father texted me later saying he understood why I did it even if it made dinner a little tense. And if you are wondering whether I ever tried to share good news the proper way and got burned so badly that it changed me, you are asking the right question, because there was one time I offered them the freshest, most hopeful thing in my life and watched it get deflated right in front of me, and that was the day I stopped handing my joy to people who treat it like a plot twist they did not approve. And that story is the one that led me to the guest list I refused to explain at the barbecue. And once you hear it, the silence I left on that patio will make perfect sense. There is a very specific day, burned so clearly into my memory that I can still replay the exact sound of my mother's voice and the way the air seemed to thin around me. When I realized that giving my family a front row seat to my happiness was not an act of connection, but an open invitation for them to poke holes in it until it sagged, and that day has been the quiet engine behind almost every choice I have made since, including the decision to keep certain victories out of their reach. Entirely. I had been working on a project for months, something that was not just a side hobby, but the kind of thing you throw your whole self into because you can see where it might lead, and against all the odds that they love to warn me about. I had landed a deal with a company that not only believed in it, but wanted to invest real money, and for the first time in years I felt that electric combination of pride and relief, the sense that all the late nights and self-doubt might finally pay off in a way no one could ignore. I remember sitting in my car outside my apartment, holding my phone, thinking that maybe this was the moment I could finally give my parents something to brag about without caveats, something that would shift the balance at the table so I was not just steady and sensible, but someone worth the kind of applause they reserved for my sister's every new idea. I called them that evening, catching them just as they were settling in after dinner, and I launched into the story, starting with the smallest details and building up to the part where the company had not only signed the deal but was already making plans for a public announcement, and I expected at least a gasp or an excited, "Tell us more." But what I got instead was the sound of my mother saying, "That's nice, but are you sure it's stable?" You know how these things go. My father followed with a half laugh and the kind of practical questions that feel like sandbags tied to your feet, asking whether I had a backup plan in case it didn't work out, whether I had considered sticking to something more consistent for the long term. It was like tossing them a sparkler and watching them pour water over it before it could catch. And then, because Hannah happened to be there for dinner that night, she jumped in with a story about how she was thinking of starting a new side project, something she hadn't even begun yet, and suddenly the energy in the room shifted entirely in her direction. With my mother leaning in and my father's tone changing to the one he used when he saw real potential, which was apparently something my actual, signed, financially backed deal did not have. I sat there on speakerphone, listening to them plan out her hypothetical next step, while my very real achievement drifted into the background like it had never been mentioned. That was the moment I decided I was done handing them the power to set the tone for my own milestones. I remember hanging up, sitting in the dark with my phone still in my lap, and feeling this cold clarity settle in, the realization that I could keep waiting for them to respond the way I hoped, or I could accept that they wouldn't, and that the only way to protect my excitement was to stop offering it up for their approval. It was not a dramatic vow, no slammed doors or shouted declarations, just a quiet, deliberate shift in my own behavior that started that night and has never really ended. From then on, I told them less and less. If something good happened, I shared it with the people who had earned the right to hear it, friends who asked because they cared, colleagues who knew the work it took, and the few relatives who didn't turn every conversation into a competition between me and Hannah. I started learning how to let success be mine without rushing to get validation from people who saw me as background noise. And the more I practiced it, the more I realized how freeing it was to have achievements they knew nothing about, victories that didn't have to be compared or explained or justified. It wasn't about punishing them, not at first. It was about survival, about keeping my energy intact instead of letting it be chipped away by the same tired dynamic. But over time, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a certain satisfaction in knowing they were out of the loop. Every so often, someone in the extended family would mention something they'd heard from a mutual friend or a social post they stumbled across, and my mother's voice would take on that sharp, curious edge as she tried to get details from me. I learned to give just enough to confirm that yes, I was doing fine, but never enough for her to turn it into a story that fit her narrative. When the opportunity came for the biggest win of my life, the one I knew could change everything, my first instinct was not to call them, not to make the same mistake I had before. I remember standing in my kitchen the night I got the news, phone in hand, feeling the urge to hear someone say, "I'm proud of you," and instead dialing a friend who had been in my corner since day one. That call gave me everything I needed: joy, validation, the sense that someone truly saw me, and it confirmed that I had made the right choice years ago when I decided my family didn't get access to my happiness on demand. Looking back, I think that day, the day of the phone call about my deal, was the turning point where I stopped being the afterthought in my own story, even if they still saw me that way. And if you're wondering what the big win was that I kept to myself, the one I refused to invite them into, the one behind that guest list comment at the barbecue, we're getting there, because the truth is, that win didn't just fall into my lap. It came from years of quiet work, deliberate choices, and the decision to build something so solid they couldn't touch it even if they tried. And when they eventually found out about it, the look on my mother's face was worth every single second of staying silent. When people assume that keeping something important from your family is an act of pettiness or spite, they almost always imagine a scenario where you are standing on the sidelines, arms crossed, waiting for them to notice you. But in reality, for me, it was nothing like that. It was a choice built from years of watching my news get reshaped into something smaller, safer, or somehow less worthy, and by the time the opportunity for my biggest professional leap came along, the habit of guarding what mattered most to me was so ingrained that I didn't even need to debate whether I would tell them. It was already decided before I had even signed the papers. It started with a conversation I had over coffee with a mentor who had seen me work through the dead-end jobs, the low-paying side hustles, and the kind of projects that collapse under their own weight before anyone outside the room even knows they existed. She told me there was a small but serious group of investors looking for someone who could not only build a service, but actually make it run with precision, and she thought I was the one they needed. At first, I laughed, because I was so used to thinking of myself as the one still climbing that I couldn't quite picture being the person chosen to lead something significant. But the more we talked, the more I could feel that rare alignment of timing, skill, and sheer luck, and when she made the introduction, I walked into that meeting knowing I might leave with my entire trajectory changed. And that's exactly what happened. In less than a month, I went from running a modest operation with a handful of clients to being at the head of a partnership that would take my work nationwide, complete with a launch budget I had only ever seen in other people's press releases. There were contracts, legal meetings, branding decisions, and hiring calls, and through all of it I felt this deep, steady pride in the fact that I had built something worth expanding without having to fight for my seat at the table. I had earned it, and the people in the room knew it. That alone would have been enough to make me want to savor it in peace, but what sealed my decision to keep it private was remembering that phone call years earlier, when my last major success had been reduced to, "Are you sure it's stable?" within minutes. So, when the time came to plan the official launch, I made a guest list that was shorter than anything I'd ever sent out in my life. It included friends who had seen me through both wins and breakdowns, colleagues who understood the significance of what we were doing, and a handful of mentors who had fought for me when they didn't have to. What it did not include was my mother, my father, or my sister. I told myself it was for the sake of keeping the event focused on the work, not on family politics, but the truth was that I wanted one night, just one, where my success was celebrated without being reframed, minimized, or turned into a launchpad for someone else's story. The launch night itself was better than I could have imagined. The room was full of people who knew the work behind the win, and every conversation I had felt genuine, free from the little barbs or comparisons I had trained myself to dodge. We signed our first big client right there at the event. Cameras caught the moment, and the press coverage started rolling in within days. It was exactly the kind of night my mother would have loved to tell people about, except she didn't even know it had happened. And that, I will admit, was its own kind of satisfaction. Of course, nothing stays secret forever, especially when your work starts making the rounds in local business news and industry publications. It took about 3 weeks before a cousin sent me a screenshot of an article with the caption, "Look at you," and before long, those whispers reached my parents. The first time my mother brought it up, she did it in that carefully casual tone that's meant to sound offhand, but is actually loaded with questions. "I heard you've been busy," she said, as if I'd been gardening a little more than usual, and I simply nodded and said, "I have," without offering anything else. She didn't like that, not one bit. Over the next few days, the calls and texts started, not directly asking for details, but circling around them, offering little hooks for me to bite so she could pull the story out. I didn't bite. Instead, I kept my updates vague, giving her just enough to confirm that yes, something was happening, but no, she wasn't going to get the full picture. And every time I held back, I could feel the shift, the growing realization on her part that there were parts of my life she no longer had access to, and that she had, in some way, done that to herself. The real twist came when a mutual acquaintance posted photos from the launch, tagging several people who had been there. My mother saw them, of course, and that's when she called and said, in a voice that was trying to be calm, "I just don't understand why you wouldn't invite us. We are your family." And for the first time in my life, I told her the truth without softening it, because I wanted to celebrate without having to compete for my own moment. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that I almost wondered if the call had dropped, but when she finally spoke, all she said was, "That's very hurtful." I didn't apologize. I didn't rush to explain or soothe. I just said, "It's honest," and ended the call. And in that moment, I knew that when the barbecue came around, if she ever tried to measure me against Hannah again, I had the kind of answer that would stop the table cold, because this wasn't just about one event. It was about drawing a line so clear that even she couldn't pretend not to see it. What I didn't expect was that she would push it anyway, right there in front of everyone, forcing me to choose between playing along and delivering the line I'd been holding onto like a loaded card. And when I finally did, the look on her face told me she'd realized exactly what she had missed, and why. The only thing left was to decide how much more to tell her, and that decision, as you'll see, came in the very last move I made. I went back to the barbecue moment because that is where everything tightened and snapped into a new position, and after my line landed and the usual noise failed to rush back in to save her. My mother tried to hold the room with a half laugh and that sing-song voice she uses for announcements, and she said she did not understand what guest list I was talking about. And if I had something to share with the family, I should share it like an adult instead of playing coy, and I looked at her and, for once, I did not swallow the urge to be direct. I did not try to soften anything. I did not reach for a joke that would release the tension and let the pattern roll on, because I knew that if I gave her the old escape hatch, we would all be back in our assigned spots before the plates were cleared. So I told her, in the same even tone I would use with a client I respected, that I had celebrated a launch a while back, that it had been the most important night of my professional life so far, and that I had invited the people who had proven they knew how to show up for me, and that she was not among them, and while that sounded cold, it was the truth, and if we were going to pretend we were a family that valued honesty, then we could start there. Hannah made a small sound, not quite a question and not quite a warning, because even she could feel that this was not the usual sparring, and I could tell she was bracing for me to swing at her instead of the dynamic that shaped us. So before my mother could redirect, I turned to my sister and told her, sincerely and without sarcasm, that opening a business was hard and brave, and that I was rooting for her to make it work, and that is when my mother jumped in with that bright, brittle gratitude she uses to claim a victory, telling me that support from the family would be crucial and maybe I could help with some marketing ideas if my schedule allowed, and I almost laughed because the setup was so predictable, but I did not laugh. I took a breath and said there was one specific way I had already helped, and that it might be better if she heard it from me now rather than from a tag in a photo or a forwarded article later. I told them that when my company finalized its expansion, part of the deal included an equity position in a small commercial holding group. Nothing flashy, nothing they would recognize from a skyline photo, but solid, boring, very real. The kind of thing my father always claimed to admire even if he never quite saw it when I did it, and that one of the properties in that group happened to be the little strip where Hannah had just signed her lease, and the silence that followed was not theatrical. It was the sound of an old chessboard getting cleared in a single move, because my mother understood, before I even said it, what that meant, and my father looked at the table the way he always does when he is deciding whether to step in or step back. And my sister blinked fast and asked, very carefully, what exactly I meant by involved. I said it plainly, because plain language is a blade when you have spent years deflecting with niceties, and I told her that I was a managing partner with a limited but meaningful vote, that I had deliberately stayed out of her lease negotiation because I did not want even the shadow of a conflict, that her terms were market standard and fair, and that the only fingerprints I left on the process were the ones she would like, which were a build-out credit that came from our improvement budget, and a short rent concession to help with the first month's cash flow, both already executed and not contingent on anything except her opening on time. And I watched that land in her face and watched my mother start to gather herself for a performance about family unity and generosity and how we could have celebrated this together if only I had trusted her. Before she could spin it into a script where she was the wise matriarch reconciling her daughters, I added the part that was not for show but for boundary, and I said that all communications about the property went through the management office, that I would not be the person handling her maintenance or complaints or signage approvals, that I had put those professional walls up on purpose, and that I was telling them this not to flex or threaten, but to make it clear that I had built a life where my success did not have to be filtered through family politics, and my mother opened her mouth to protest something about respect, so I gave her the last piece, the one I had been saving because it was both the cleanest kindness and the sharpest edge. I told them that the night of my launch, the night they were not invited to because I had no interest in watching it be turned into a debate about whether I was being realistic, I had signed a foundation grant in my own name that funded a small program for women starting first-time businesses within our local community, a program that covered their first few months of operating costs and matched them with mentors who would answer questions without making them feel like a burden, and that the Very first award under that grant had already been set aside for a tenant in our property who met the criteria, and then I paused long enough for my sister to realize I was looking at her, and I said she qualified, and the paperwork was ready. And if she wanted the support no strings attached beyond the usual compliance, it was hers, and that I had designed it that way on purpose so that my help would never look like a rope around anyone's neck. Hannah's eyes filled in a way that told me she had been carrying more weight than the announcements let on, and she started to say thank you and then stopped, overwhelmed in the way people get when they are treated like adults who deserve a decent chance. And my father managed a small, proud sound that felt like it had to push through years of habit to reach daylight, and my mother, who had been ready to claim the whole thing as a family triumph, realized she could not, because the terms were not hers to frame, and the story did not center her, and the look that crossed her face was not anger exactly, it was recognition laced with the discomfort of finally being told no by someone she assumed would always chase her yes. I stood up then, not to make a scene but to end one, and I told them I would send Hannah the contact at the management office, and the grant paperwork, and that I was happy for her and genuinely excited to see her succeed, and then I added, looking at my mother without heat, that if she wanted to be on the guest list next time, the price of admission was simple and non-negotiable, which was to clap when I succeed without immediately asking whether I deserve it, to stop comparing us like we were contestants on a game she designed, and to treat my news like news and not a draft that needed her edits, and I left it there, because there was nothing else to add that would not dilute the point. On the drive home, I waited for the usual doubt to sneak in, that old instinct that tells you to apologize for making people uncomfortable, and it didn't come, not even a little. And the next morning my sister called and said she had read through the grant, and she wanted it, and that she understood why I did not invite them that night, and then she said something I did not expect, which was that she was tired of being the main character in a story that kept me small, and that if I wanted to start fresh, she did too, and we could keep our mother on her own stage while we ran our lives like grown women who did not need referees. As for my mother, she sent a message that tried to fold everything into a lesson about forgiveness and family, and I wrote back one sentence that said I loved her and that I would not reopen the debate about my choices. And then I turned off my phone for an hour and made coffee and sat with the calm that comes after a clean decision. And if you are waiting for a neat bow, I do not have one, because families like mine do not change in a single afternoon. But I can tell you this much with absolute certainty. When I said you were not on the guest list, it was not a threat or a tease. It was a new rule. And by the time dessert hit the table, everyone understood it. And the win was not that I owned the building or cut the check or delivered the stinging line. The win was that I took back the pen and wrote my name in bold on the life they used to footnote, and I did it without asking permission.